welcome everyone to another week of the Behavior, Evolution, and Culture Speaker Series. We meet every week of the academic year when UCLA is in session in this room, and the remainder of this quarter with in-person speakers, yay. We also do have a Zoom option, so if you can't be here in person with us, then please join us on Zoom. Before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to give you a little update of upcoming talks. So next week is President's Day. We're not in session, so there's no Beck next week. But on February 27th, the following Monday, Anash Childabayeva is joining us. And her talk is entitled Population Genetics and Signatures of Selection in Early Neolithic European Farmers. So please join us for that. And I'm very pleased to welcome Tina Lasisi this week, whose talk is entitled Hair, Skin, and the Racialization of Human Variation. She's joining us from right here in LA, where she is at USC for the year before she heads off to the University of Michigan in the fall. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the welcome. Hope you guys are enjoying lunch. I saw that you guys already have a tip jar. I appreciate all the donations. Jokes aside, Brooke, are you sure I can start? Are there any other people who might be joining?
No, I think we've got everybody.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks again for having me here. I'm going to be talking about the research that I've done on hair and skin for the last 11 years and putting that in the broader context of racializing and categorizing human traits. So, hot take. I think that there are few phrases that confuse people as much as race is a social construct, and yet it's a phrase that is often offered as an explanation, and biological anthropologists especially find themselves often in conversations about what race is and what it isn't. And depending on who you ask, our discipline is either partially or entirely responsible for the invention of race. So what's extra funny, I think, about the whole thing is that now you see that anthropologists are among the ones who are backpedaling the hardest to undo what our predecessors did by doing things like telling people that race is a social construct or making statements. So, since the 20th century, anthropologists have been among many groups of people who've been issuing statements about the non-existence of race. And actually, not too long ago, I was involved with the latest statement on race and racism put together by the American Association of, now finally, biological anthropologists. But to be completely honest with you, I kind of question the utility of making such statements. Of course, they have their place. We definitely needed an updated statement. But if we're trying to make a dent in the public's understanding of human variation and race, as well as the understanding that other scientists have of this concept, does this approach really get the desired effect? I would say that it doesn't, because racialized thinking persists. And the question that I always have is why? Why does racialized thinking persist? Why do people still keep framing things in the context of race? And over the years, I've heard a lot of different reasons, and quite often, I hear people complaining that this is an issue of a lack of education, that people just haven't learned the right thing, or that the educational system hasn't caught up with all the evidence that we now have of how human variation actually works and how race really isn't a biological reality. But from my perspective, that doesn't align with what I see, because race persists within science as well. Whether it's explicit or wrapped up in the euphemistic ethnicity, population, or ancestry, we see what are basically the same racial groupings everywhere from clinical studies to forensics, physiology, and pretty much anything that involves humans. And what's, I'm not going to say worse, but what's more is that, especially over the last few years, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this at the end, what we see from tech companies especially, and what we see in dermatology and in a lot of other disciplines, is this conflation of skin color especially with ancestry and other ancestry-linked traits. So to put this all simply, I don't think that the reason that race persists is because there's been an issue with the transmission of the information that we so clearly have. I think that there's a deeper issue of how science on human variation is being conducted, particularly when it comes to methods on measuring and describing traits that vary among people. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to walk you through what we've learned as a discipline and in general from studying skin color. Then I'm going to spend some time exploring why hair hasn't exactly followed the same path, and that's going to include some results from my research. And finally, I want to conclude with a discussion of the implications of these things for matters outside of anthropology. So, skin color, one of our favorite examples of human variation, is really the quintessential story of what can be gained when you have the proper tools to measure a trait and when you're using something that is objective to the best that we can and biologically informed. So reflectance spectrophotometers are the gold standard for objectively measuring skin pigmentation. These are instruments like the one that you see here that are capable of giving us, among other measures, melanin index, or M index, which is used as a proxy for the amount of melanin in someone's skin. But it's very easy to forget that we did not always discuss skin color this way. One very vintage way of discussing skin color involves the literal assignment of colors to races. I frequently like to blame Linnaeus and taxonomy for all of these things, but for now, I'm just going to say that this simplification of human groups into different types is really the central factor that is problematic and reoccurring, rather than necessarily the groups themselves and how we name them. So what's important to take away from this, and what's sometimes lost when we talk about race being a social construct, is that some people take away from this that, oh, we shouldn't talk about differences between groups. But you can learn a lot from comparing and contrasting different groupings of people. In fact, that is how we've learned about some of the fixed alleles that explain genetic differences in skin color between populations that have been separated for a relatively long amount of time. But you also miss a lot of variation. If it wasn't for the use of melanin index, we wouldn't have been able to understand the genetic architecture of skin pigmentation variation within the African continent, because it just would have been described as homogeneously dark. And one of the things about genetic associations is if you can't look at variation, if you can't tell subtle distinctions between people, it becomes very difficult to make statistical associations that tell you something about how those phenotypic variations pair with genetic variation. In fact, for the longest time, the molecular literature on skin color focused on the lack of African variation at the MC1R locus. So that's the melanocortin 1 receptor gene. In contrast, Europeans were very polymorphic. They had a lot of variation at MC1R. And so this lack of variation in Africans was interpreted as a functional constraint on skin pigmentation and pigmentation in general. Now, I'm going to be fair. This paper is 20 years old, but I still think that it is worthwhile to unpack it because it reflects long-standing historical views on pigmentation and how variability is structured among populations. And this is basically a thematic thing that keeps reoccurring. And something that I find pretty striking is the way that in this paper, there's a recurrent discussion of skin and hair as joint traits. In fact, a lot of the associations with MC1R variants appear to be mainly informed by studies of hair color in Europeans. So that's an important thing to pause on. Can you look at different people's hair colors and then extrapolate, oh, well, their hair color is variable, therefore we can just say their pigmentation is variable, versus people whose hair color isn't apparently visibly variable to us, they're pretty homogeneous. Now, discussing hair and skin in tandem really gives the impression that you can confidently infer an effect from one to be informative about the other. And if we dig a little further into the methods of this paper, we see that they used a wide range of European populations with additional phenotypes, i.e. hair color. But African diversity is represented by 2 West African populations, although they say also African immigrants from the UK, and African Americans. Asia is represented by Japan, Papua New Guinea, and southern India, which might not be the groupings that we'd use today, but also this tells us something about just the resolution and the range of variation that they're getting from Europe, this relatively small geographic span, versus everywhere else is kind of collapsed, which is also counter to what we might do if we go from the null hypothesis of how genetic diversity is distributed genetically, or how genetic diversity is distributed across the world. So this really reflects one of the main themes in the literature, that is this erroneous idea that Europeans are variable and others are homogeneous. And it's not really controversial to say that genetic research has historically overrepresented Europeans to the detriment of others. But what I think is often missed in these discussions is that phenotyping matters. How we talk about traits, describe them, measure them, that matters. The methods that we use strongly influence our ability to detect certain kinds of genetic variation. And that's why these 2017 papers on African skin pigmentation from Sarah Tishkoff and Brenna Henn's labs made such a huge impact. They both countered this widespread narrative that Africans were homogeneous in their pigmentation and the genetic variation that was underlying that phenotypic variation. And this isn't just a fun debunking of a Eurocentric view. This is really a scientific victory in being able to discern previously invisibilized variation, and it really represented a leap forward in our ability to understand the evolutionary history of this trait, which was a lot more complex than some people thought it was. So, why haven't we seen a similar development with hair? In brief, it has to do with how we describe hair. So, this map over here is from the Italian geographer Renato Biasutti, and it's one of those classical physical anthropology maps. I like it. It's vintage. That just kind of tries to give you this view of this is how different people are around the world, and it's based on ethnographic data. We can go into that, but let's just take that for granted now. Based on ethnographic data. And what you see in the legend is descriptions of hair morphology. So some of these, they describe a continuum of curvature from straight to curly. Other terms describe cross-sectional properties. So if you cut a hair fiber through and you look at its cross-section, it can be round and it can be flattened. It can actually be a lot of different shapes in between. But what you are seeing here is basically this pairing of different aspects of a trait, or possibly different traits, that are thought to go together. So basically, what you're seeing here is this implication that straight hair is necessarily going to be hair that has a cylindrical or a round cross-section, and that curly hair is, by necessity, going to be flat in its cross-section. Now, this is something that has persisted and still persists. Now, to some of you, this terminology might seem a little bit outdated, and you might think, oh, this is from the 50s. We've solved this. But unfortunately, I'd have to disappoint you. This is not just something that stayed in the 50s or even in anthropology in this sense. This is something that you see reflected in forensics. So other disciplines think about hair. Forensics is one of them. And in that field, hair can be considered trace evidence in certain contexts. And one of the analyses that is carried out is this determination of racial origin, where qualitative assessments are made of the hair and basically used to assign them to different racial categories. Another field that often uses racialized approaches to hair is dermatology. Now, if you look at this table here, you see that those different descriptions align very closely with what you see in the map. So here you have this table that basically suggests that people whose biological race is black have frizzy hair with flat cross sections. Then Oriental people are so invariable in having straight hair that it really suffices to have one representative. And of course, white people are uniquely diverse and have a range of colors and hair textures. But jokes aside, the absence of vocabulary is really what I want you to note. The absence of vocabulary for the range of variation beyond Europeans really limits how we can study hair. And you might think, we've done better since then. You know, genetics seems like people who do things rigorously. They might have a better method. But again, I'd probably be disappointing you. So if you consider studies that have looked at genome-wide associations of hair, the phenotyping method, so how they measured the trait, is mostly based on subjectively classifying hair into the familiar categories of straight, wavy, and curly. There was a recent meta-analysis of a bunch of different genetic association studies where this was the method used by 5 of the 8 studies that they were including. Now, there was 2 other studies where they included frizzy as a category, and then there was another study that split slightly wavy from wavy and gave us big curls and small curls. But regardless of the classification system, regardless of how many categories you have, they are racialized, and I don't think that if you look at the distribution of the variation in the categories, I don't think that it's a coincidence that the meta-analysis was mainly on Eurasian populations. So the thing is, if we want to quantitatively phenotype hair, we first need to consider what level of morphology we're interested in. There's the entire scalp, which is usually what people are describing when they give you like one-word description of someone's hair texture. But you can also look at the individual hair fiber. You can go further than that, look at microstructure, and you can even look at hair on a molecular level. Now, for me, I spent like the last decade looking at the level of the individual fiber, where I looked at the cross-section and curvature. Curvature describes the spectrum of straight to tightly curled hair, and cross-sectional morphology includes variation in shape from, one way of thinking about it is from round to how elliptical it is, which is known as eccentricity. And then you can also talk about the cross-sectional area, which is usually what people actually mean when they talk about fine versus coarse hair. So you see how like even that offers like a little bit of clarification for something that was a pretty vague descriptor, but also has connotations of quality, like something being fine versus being coarse is very different from, oh, you know, the cross-sectional area of this hair is quite large. Now, if classifying is so bad, why aren't more people measuring? Turns out that it's really hard and takes a lot of time. The Cliff Notes version is, it requires a lot of effort. So the 2 aspects of hair morphology that I talked about, cross-section and curvature, both have existing methods for how you can carefully measure them. With cross-sections, you need to embed a sample and section it so that you can look at it under a microscope. However, embedding in resin takes time for it to cure, it takes effort and specific kind of materials to cut through it. And then curvature is even more finicky because you want to reduce that 3-dimensional curl into 2 dimensions so that you can easily measure it as an arc of a circle. So there's distortion and subjectivity. I literally spent like 7 years of my life developing methods, and as much as I would love to subject you to all of the details of it, I'm just going to summarize by saying I made some new methods, and I published about, 2 years ago now? And the Cliff Notes version of this is I developed lab protocols that allow us to have a uniform, standardized way that is explicit to process the hairs, both for the cross-section and the curvature, and fixed one of the problems of embedding by using a low melt point plastic, where you can immediately encase the hair, which is what you see here in that little video. And then I also wrote a Python program that allows you to take the pictures that you've gotten with those lab protocols and just click and have it all be measured, and it'll spit out numbers. However, even with all of that work, even with a cute little Python program and a nice protocol, it still takes time and effort. It is infinitely more difficult than pointing at someone and being like, your hair seems slightly wavy. And a lot of people question me. Why? What was the reason? Was it worth the effort? Now, I'm going to show you some results that hopefully convince you that it was worth the effort. So what I want to focus on is, first is the populations that we've looked at so far in terms of the genetics of hair morphology. From what I could find, most genetic association studies on hair morphology were on Europeans, East Asians with a few Southeast Asians, and I found studies referring to US and Australian populations, but invariably, if you read in the methods section, they would find some subtle way of telling you, but they are of European descent, wink, wink. So not really diverse. The most diverse sample that I could find was a 2016 study that looked at an admixed Latin American population. So first, that gave me a lot of hope that the glaring omission of the entire African continent might be rectified. But I was disappointed. It wasn't quite what I hoped for. And part of the reason for this is because of the phenotyping methods in the study. When I looked more closely, I found that hair was typed using a 4-point scale of straight, wavy, curly, or frizzy. Again, just descriptive terms. Another issue is that they say that so few individuals were scored as having frizzy hair that they excluded them from the genetic association study for hair shape. Now, because the category of frizzy is so racialized, I suspected that this low representation of the hair category itself might reflect a relative dearth of African ancestry in the general sample. And a closer look revealed that indeed the entire sample did have very low proportions of African ancestry. So here basically you see the different countries that they sampled in on the x-axis, and every bar is an individual. The different colors reflect the proportions of ancestry that are attributed to European, African, and indigenous American ancestry. And so the African component, which is the orange component, you can see that that is not well represented at all. So what happens when you start off with a low proportion of African ancestry in your sample to begin with, and then subsequently you remove everyone who's categorized as having frizzy hair? Well, then you erase people who are racialized as black and whatever range of variation they carry in that trait. But what is frizzy hair even? The best way to understand this descriptor, as it's most widely used in the literature, not even just the genetic association literature, but just in general, is that this is a term that is a racialized category that refers to tightly curled hair that is considered to occur naturally only in African populations or others racialized as black. Now, I just want you to take a mental note, bookmark for that naturally, because we're going to come back to that later. This idea that frizzy African hair is fundamentally, categorically different from other types is reinforced by not so subtle statements like the one from that 2018 meta-analysis. It says categories 1 and 2 define straight hair, type 3 reflects wavy hair, and types 4 and 5 refer to curly hair typical for people of European ancestry. So that last little bit, typical for people of European ancestry, is doing a lot of work to tell you that there is something fundamentally different about curls that are not European. And so that kind of breaks this idea of you have this continuous trait, right? Now the categories that this is referring to are based on a 2007 paper from L'Oreal where they measured different aspects of hair morphology, and their goal was to come up with an objective classification system that did not refer to people's ethnicity or race. But ironically, it seems that a lot of people keep citing this paper as an excuse to justify the categories of hair that they think are real and associated with particular races, as you see here. Now, I'll save my critique for that paper for another time, but we can just start and finish by saying that it kind of just drew circles around groups that they felt fit together, and their categories weren't well justified to begin with. But this is the thing about categorization. There's going to be, unless the trait is really categorical in nature, some objective cutoff points and some subjective decisions on what variation matters and what variation can just be grouped together. So knowing that the reality of biology is one of multi-dimensional continuous variation, we can step beyond the limitations of racial taxonomies by doing something like looking at admixed populations, because fundamentally you're breaking this idea of these purely different non-overlapping populations. So in cases when there is a mean difference in a phenotype between populations, one way to study whether that difference is due to genetic effects is by looking at admixed populations, which of course has been done extensively in European African admixed populations like this one, where we find a correlation between the proportion of African ancestry on the x-axis and this measure of melanin index on the y-axis. So basically what this is telling you is the larger the proportion of African ancestry, the darker the skin is on average, and really what that's reflecting is if you have more segments of African ancestry and the trait is very polygenic, or a lot of genes that contribute to it, it also means that if you have more African ancestry, you probably have more African variants of skin color related genes, and therefore you will be closer to the phenotype of that ancestry. So with this in mind, one of the things that I did during my PhD is look at hair morphology in African European admixed individuals. So I wanted to use skin pigmentation as this reference trait that we already knew a lot about. And I had grand plans to sample hundreds of admixed individuals, but because of the pandemonium, I had to make do with samples I already had. So I chose from these individuals from an existing sample that I was part of collecting in Mark Shriver's lab, and I chose individuals based on ancestry first. So I was looking for people who had predominantly African and European ancestry. Then I filtered for people who had at least 10% of African ancestry, and then of course I was limited by who we had hair samples for, which left me with a grand total of 193 individuals. For all of them, I was able to use my new methods to measure curvature. For most of them, I also had reflectance, so melanin index. And for a lot of them, I was also able to do cross-sectional measures. So now I want to show you some results that will hopefully convince you that I did not waste a decade of my life with these methods. First, I wanted to look at this sample and see if we could see this correlation between ancestry and skin pigmentation that has been demonstrated in other admixed African European populations. And in my sample, yes, we saw that. That means I didn't mess up something grand. That's great. Again, on the x-axis, African ancestry, and on the y-axis, we have melanin index. Next, I was primarily interested in hair curvature. So that spectrum of variation between straight to tightly curled hairs. And amazingly, it showed basically an equally strong correlation. And we love a good correlation. We love statistical significance. So here we have on the y-axis, instead of skin color, hair curvature going from straight to very tightly curled. What's important to note here is that this disrupts the notion of a homogeneous, frizzy or kinky hair type. We see that the variation is continuous, just like in skin color. And that suggests that just like what we see in skin color, genetic differences that underlie the difference in hair curvature, specifically between West Africans and Europeans, might have a similar basis. And we can't say from this what the genetic architecture of hair is, but it does give us hope that it is worth actually carefully measuring this trait instead of just categorizing people based on how we feel about their hair. So, to tell you a little bit more about what we were missing, I want to show you a comparison with categorical variables. In that same sample, so basically the same plot that you saw there, I color the individuals by objective hair category. So this is me being really nice and pretending that we can actually be objective about this and picking cutoff points that have previously been suggested for what constitutes straight, wavy, and tightly curled hair. And what you see is that tightly curled hair or very curly hair, this dark green, is a huge range of variation that is being collapsed. Now, that is basically the best case scenario if we were actually doing this objectively, but we also have self-reported hair curvature, which is actually much more in line with what a lot of the genetic association studies use, and we see that it's a hot mess. On the x-axis, we have median curvature, so that represents the objective variation, measured variation between straight to tightly curled, and then on the y-axis, we see the different self-reported descriptors that people use for their hair. Luckily, we can all agree on what straight hair is, so that's actually really good. Wavy, there are some people who consider their hair to be wavy, even though it is higher in curvature than some people who describe their hair as curly or even very curly. Now, there's actually a lot of interesting stuff going on here because the sample that I had had individuals who had anywhere between 10 and 100% African ancestry, and I actually think that some of what we were seeing was basically race identity dependent descriptors of hair. So maybe somebody who identifies as black also maybe has darker skin but has relatively loosely curled hair for someone of similar ancestry might consider their hair to be curly instead of very curly, versus somebody with predominantly European ancestry might have a lower threshold for what they consider very curly hair, right? And so you kind of see how this is all an issue when you're trying to actually study the biological basis of these traits. So another point that I wanted to address is this idea that curvature is intrinsically linked to cross-section. To recap, because African hair is stereotyped as having a flat cross-section and it's very curly, and Asian hair is stereotyped as having a round cross-section and being very straight, you often see people drawing the conclusion that, oh, it must be because of the cross-section that straight hair is straight, and because of the cross-section that curly hair is curled. So what is nice about this admixed sample is that if there's truly a physical link between those things, because that's what you see a lot of people saying, it's like a ribbon. Don't ask me how that makes sense, but it makes sense to some people. It's like a ribbon because it's flat, it's like more curled. Then we should see that in the admixed population as well. But if it's actually something that co-occurs, these two traits are something that co-occur in different ancestry groups, that is going to be reflected in our admixed sample. So what you see here on the x-axis is eccentricity, so from round to elliptical, and curvature straight to tightly curled, and it's kind of correlated. I'll take that. But once you correct for ancestry, you see that that correlation disappears. So what this means is that the correlation that you see is driven by ancestry stratification. So that suggests that we should actually look at these traits separately. Now, I'm not saying that cross-sectional morphology does not contribute to curvature at all. It may, but it isn't something that is predictive of it necessarily. And the reason I want to pause on this is to bring it back to the importance of methods. One of the issues that leads to racializing human variation continuously, even after we throw away the explicitly racial categories, is having qualitative categories and composite phenotypes. So phenotypes that are actually a bunch of different phenotypes that you group together and are like, oh, this is one thing, but that's just because it occurs together in certain groups. And I will admit that to most people, cross-section, curvature, whatever, it's hair. Like, do we really care? Are you really sure that it's not related? Let me give you an example that will clarify it. With skin pigmentation. So here you see melanin index on the x-axis going from light to dark, curvature on the y-axis going from straight to tightly curled. And you see correlation. But I haven't ever heard anyone say that dark skin leads to curlier hair or vice versa. And of course, once you correct for ancestry, you see that that correlation no longer exists. So that is why this is important. Like, you need to make sure that you are looking at traits independently if the biology really warrants that. So let's move away from correlations for a second and compare with other genome-wide association studies. So as I mentioned before, there have been a bunch of studies that have looked at hair morphology and underlying genetics. Most of them have not done that in populations with significant African ancestry. However, that doesn't mean they're useless, because it's possible that some of the same genetic variants that influence hair morphology in non-African populations influence them in African populations. And with my cute little 193 sample, we were able to replicate 24 previously reported loci, which I'm just going to go ahead and say is impressive for such a small sample. We may not have had the power to detect any new variants, but replicating is still useful. And I don't have the time to discuss each of them, but I want to highlight one that illustrates some of the patterns that we're looking for. So there was a SNP, a variant on chromosome 20, where previous studies reported that the C allele was associated with curlier hair. And in our study, the C allele was associated with higher curvature. Yay, same variant, same directionality, very happy. And what's even more exciting is what we see when we explore the frequency of the allele around the world. So here you see an allele frequency map. So in these different proportions, the relative frequency of the C allele, which is in orange here, and the T allele, which is predominant in Eurasia, even fixed in Eurasia. Now that is completely consistent with our expectations. I had a European-African admixed group where I was expecting that variants that contribute to curlier hair will have come from the African ancestry. But the added bonus is that we find a high frequency of this C allele in those places over there. Now, that high frequency of this C allele associated with curlier hair in Melanesian populations is exciting. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Melanesians have very tightly curled hair, similar to many African populations, although they are not African and they are not more closely related to Africans. So, as a bonus, I just want to talk about the evolutionary function of hair and skin and how perception and how we talk about these traits influences how we can even come up with hypotheses about them. Typologies really affect our perception and consequently our ability to generate hypotheses. And this is something that I always point out, this never happens in the anthropology department, but outside of anthropology, people are like, science is objective. The scientific method is objective. But the first part of the scientific method is observation. And what you observe, what you perceive, is very much going to be affected by your lived experience. Now, the way we perceive things can be a red herring. And one of my favorite examples is black versus white skin in the 50s. Now, until the 50s and even later, people thought it was weird that Negroes had black skin and lived in such sunny climates. Conundrum. Why is that? Well, it's because they considered it to be a proven fact that black skin was a disadvantage in sunnier places because obviously, black absorbs more light than white, and therefore, you don't want that in the sun. You're just going to be heating up. However, they did conclude that it was hard to demonstrate any advantage in increased melanin content. However, they did point out that it seemed a little bit weird that there was this really tight correlation between this apparently terrible dark skin and sunlight. Now, this seems silly now, but not too long ago, this was something that was taken seriously. And actually, believe it or not, a lot of times when I'm outside of anthropology, I have people ask me like, I mean, but isn't it bad to have dark skin because black objects like heat up in the sun? And you know, this doesn't come from like a malicious place, but if most of the black that you've interacted with in your life has been an object, you might not have the lived experience to know that a black object heating up in the sun is a very different response than someone that has a lot of melanin that is able to, you know, stop those rays from damaging them. And I always joke that, you know, these people, even though they were based somehow in Lagos, must not have had any black friends, because it seems really funny to me that some British dude would have been in a sunny place turning into a lobster and concluded that dark skin was a disadvantage. But moving on from skin color in this objective sense and actually starting to measure it was something that didn't just allow us to appreciate the range of variation in humans. It allowed us to see the distribution of that variation and form and test hypotheses that helped us understand why it evolved the way that it did. And curvature, I would say, moves us away from another significant misnomer: woolly hair. And when I talk to people about woolly hair syndrome, they're often shocked and appalled that such a racist medical condition exists. But this idea that tightly curled hair is like wool has a very long and persistent history. And personally, I wonder how much of a role it played in us neglecting the potential function of tightly curled hair as something that protects us from solar radiation. So while I don't have time to go into it very long, I do briefly want to mention some of the other work that I did that, to my knowledge, is the first to demonstrate that hair minimizes heat gain from specifically solar radiation. We did some experiments that looked at the difference between no hair on the scalp and hair on the scalp, as well as different levels of curvature. And what we saw is that hair offered some protection, but most interestingly, to me at least, we showed that there was a clear pattern between increased hair curvature and decreased solar heat gain, and a reduced need for sweating to cool down, which you can imagine would have been a very handy trait for your, early evolution hominins. And we just put up a preprint describing these results for those of you who are interested. So with all of this information, I want to conclude by discussing the implications of this work on human variation and future plans. So nowadays, I spend a lot of time thinking about human variation outside of anthropology in a number of realms. One of them is dermatology. So dermatology and medicine in general, I find like really interesting fields for looking at how people look at human variation. If you look at the history of medicine, it makes sense that the framework that they have for variation is the normal, the healthy body, and the pathological sick body. And so that framework, to some extent, allows, maybe even requires, to have a huge simplification of what it means to be normal, what it means to be abnormal. However, over time, obviously, a lot of medical practitioners, medical researchers have realized that whatever we're going to call normal or healthy is actually going to be multiple variants of it, because different things might represent normal for different people. Now, how do you then create those different templates of normal and pathological for different groups? It's especially interesting to look at dermatology, because if you look at the history of that field, it's something that was reserved for, that was developed like relatively recently compared to some other branches of medicine, and that was reserved for people who had the money to think about their appearance. Now, not everything in dermatology is cosmetic, but a lot of dermatological conditions might not be life-threatening. And so if you think about the places where dermatologists are going to be available to people and what's covered, what's not covered, not even thinking about insurance, it's reflected in where the research has gone and who the resources are designed for. Now, there's been a lot of dermatologists of color, especially who've recently really pushed for dermatology having more reference material and really catering to everyone. But what's interesting is that in doing so, they create these abnormal categories. So you'll have books like this, and I actually co-wrote a chapter on anthropology of hair in either this edition or another one. But this idea of ethnic hair and skin, like what is ethnic hair and skin? What is non-ethnic? Like this idea of, again, like, there's this default normal, and then there's other. And there's an issue there because you can end up conflating different things. So ethnic skin, is that going to be dark skin? What about individuals with albinism who come from populations that are relatively dark-skinned? Or what about admixed populations where you have the full range of skin color variation? Those things aren't necessarily going to go together. And not everything can be reduced to skin color. So even if you start talking about, oh, light skin and dark skin, there are going to be factors that are more complex than that. You're still going to have variation in skin and other traits that is structured by ancestry because it's structured by genetic similarity, but they're not something that you can categorize in the same groups that we usually use. So I do a lot of work to communicate stuff that makes sense to us as anthropologists to dermatologists. Another field that I am involved with in certain ways, I say it in this really shady way because I often just criticize it. And I want to be helpful, but there are some aspects of how human variation is used and abused in forensic contexts that is very, very worrying. I'm not going to name them. Parabon Labs have this thing here that are basically profiles that they use to help law enforcement give a face to the people that they're looking for. Now, sometimes these are victims. Sometimes these are people who are suspected perpetrators of some crime, and they create this face and create these different predicted traits for people, and it really, really gives you the impression that we can do this. Like, we know everything that there is to know about what genes underlie all of these different traits, to the point that you give me DNA and I can tell you what your face looks like. And one of my favorite things to do, because I'm a hater, is to go on their website and look at the examples that they give of, oh, look at how well we're doing, and just show that the person's face is nothing like the actual photo. Yet they'll be like, oh, no, look, we got it right. What ends up happening, Cliff Notes, is basically high-tech racial profiling, because for European populations, maybe we're able to predict to a higher resolution and with higher confidence different ranges of eye color, hair color, and even freckles, and that might be distinctive. We may have enough samples to even get a little bit more resolution on facial morphology, but in a lot of other populations, what ends up happening is that they start from a template of the consensus face for somebody with that kind of ancestry. And so it's basically saying, if this is your genetic ancestry, we're just going to, yeah, you probably look something like, the consensus for people who have that kind of ancestry. And, criticisms aside, I think it's very important for anthropologists to be aware of what is happening in these fields and also be involved in work on DNA phenotyping. How can we improve it? How can we make sure that whenever people are talking about this, it isn't misleading? And that also kind of brings me to biometrics in tech, and that is a place that I've especially started doing a lot of work in. I have some collaborators at Microsoft where we started working on facial recognition, and whether you like it or not, it's the fact that facial recognition is now used in a lot of places. A lot of companies are developing facial recognition algorithms that are trained on particular data sets. And now, even being very generous and assuming the best, and I'll tell you this, like, a lot of people that I've interacted with in tech, I do genuinely believe that they don't want their technology to be biased. They want it to be equitable. However, their grasp of the structure of human variation stops them from doing that, because they will have a training data set where they're like, we need to make sure that we represent human variation. Okay, so I made sure that a quarter of our sample is Caucasian, a quarter of our sample is Asian, a quarter is Hispanic, and a quarter is African American. Now, a lot of us who understand the structure of human variation knows that it overweights certain groups, and it pulls together certain groups that have some divergent ancestries, and that it doesn't really cover the range of human variation. And when you have these training data sets that then set the multidimensional space where our faces get populated, you're going to have issues with how well certain technologies perform on individuals. And this is both in things that are, as relatively uncontroversial as one-to-one comparisons. So something like what you use on your iPhone, there's a template for your face. How similar is your current face that is on the camera to the template that we have? But there's also one-to-many comparisons. So that's the kind of stuff that we think about when we're talking about surveillance. How sure can an algorithm be that this unknown face in the crowd is the reference sample that they have in whatever database, that is whatever suspect? And these are things that have already been put into action in the UK especially, but also in the US in different places. So what I think is very important is for us as anthropologists to move beyond explaining to people just like, this is how the structure of human variation is or isn't, and see where we can do some applied work. And I think that that is something that I've found personally very rewarding, and I'm happy to talk about it some more. But future directions. Starting this fall, you can find me in Michigan. I'm going to be at the anthropology department. And what the Lasisi lab is going to be doing includes more work on the genetic architecture and evolutionary function of hair. And yes, when I started on this question 11 years ago, I was a really adorable undergrad who really thought I was going to solve hair evolution by the end of my undergrad. And I did not. And we're still going to keep going with that because there's a lot that we have to answer. And I think it's so important that we get resolution on this trait, which represents, another huge trait that has such a big history of being a racialized trait. But I also want to start doing work that goes beyond ancestry and looking at sex as a dimension of variation. And I'm very specific in saying a dimension of variation because it is, this multidimensional space where it can affect a lot of different traits, and especially hair is really interesting to look at. Because if you look throughout an individual's lifetime, hair starts appearing in certain places or disappearing in certain places. Hair changes its texture. And so sex becomes this really interesting dimension to start looking at. And then also hair as a biomarker. So you can measure cortisol from it, you can measure sex hormones from it, you can measure a lot of things from it. But are we making sure that the protocols we have to measure all these biomarkers are taking into consideration this baseline of human variation? And this is something that I'm going to be exploring with two graduate students who are going to be part of my lab, Taylor Spencer and Sarah Taylor. And finally, of course, I'm going to continue my work looking at tech, medicine, and human biological variation. And I hope to start recruiting people who are interested in these kinds of questions. So the takeaway here is race does not just persist because of ignorance. It's much more complicated than that. It's really insidious and structures how we think about variation. Hair and skin are really useful traits to explore differences between racialization versus biology. And moving forward involves reaching outside of our discipline. Just going to thank the advisors, collaborators, and funders. And if you want to find me, you can find me here. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
thank you so much for this talk. I thought it was really interesting. And I actually had a question about the part in which you talked about the functionality of different structures of hair.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't really know much or almost anything about the phylogeny of like different hair structures. So maybe your answer will, or maybe this question is not the best.
It's probably a very good question.
I was wondering, so you talked about the benefits of very curly hair in high UV radiation environments. So I was wondering if you also have hypotheses about the costs of very curly hair at high latitudes environments.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. Okay, so if tightly curled hair is really good for losing heat, does that also represent like a disadvantage if you're in a place that is very cold? So the answer is possibly, because we definitely did see that it was easier to lose heat from tightly curled hair. But until we know more about the genetic basis of the trait and maybe can more confidently say, oh, there have been like signatures of selection in these populations, it's hard to conclude anything about it. The closest I can tell you is there's this variant of a gene called EDAR that is associated with thicker cross sections, and some people say straighter hair, and it's especially been selected for in East Asian populations. So one possible interpretation of that would be, oh, like you really needed thick, straight hair in those environments. That's what we're seeing here. However, fun thing about genes, a lot of times they have effects on a lot of different things. So EDAR also affects tooth morphology and mammary glands, and so it's not clear what the selective pressure was. But if we want to take like an even broader look, one of the points that I always like to point out is that tightly curled hair only exists in humans. And I kind of put like a bounty on that statement. If anyone can prove me wrong, please do. I have looked, everywhere that I can think of across mammals to look at, is there another mammal with tightly curled hair? And I don't find anything. The closest is maybe domesticated dogs and maybe some sheep, depending on how you look at it. But actually, sheep and a lot of other species that have curly hair, they actually have crimped hair. And that's a really important structural difference, because if you have this bilateral crimp, and we actually know the biological basis of that in sheep, because sheep are wool and wool is money, you can stack a lot of hairs on top of each other, basically, and have this dense mass that doesn't have a lot of air going through it. Human hair that is tightly coiled is basically this chaotic, situation of like a bunch of hairs going together, and it really takes up like this maximum amount of volume with a minimum amount of material, which means that you're not insulating as much as you do with crimped hair and wool. And I think, evolutionarily, if this trait is only, present in humans, I'm like, that's a fun mystery. Like, how did that happen? What are the limitations? And in tandem with that, one of the questions that we have to ask is, why did humans lose their body hair and keep their scalp hair? That's another thing that's weird. There are mammals that are naked. There are mammals that are furry. We were non-committal and decided to do a little bit of both. So those are kind of the evolutionary histories and mysteries I want to deal with. And looking at least primates first for like this broader phylogenetic view of what's going on with hair. Did I answer your question?
Not yet, but I think...
Answers in progress.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I had a question. When you showed the spectrum from looking at characteristics on like the whole scalp level down to the microscopic level, it seems like there's sort of a level missing, which is like between entire scalp and one single hair. So I'm wondering if you've thought at all, or if anyone has thought at all about sort of like locks of hair or homogeneity versus heterogeneity of curliness over the scalp. Like maybe some of the hairs are straighter than others, and maybe the extent to which that varies over the scalp differs between different people, or like has that been thought about at all?
That is a great question, and the answer is yes. And I would say that your question actually does live on the level of individual hair fibers, but we look at multiple individual hair fibers. And so one of the really, I don't want to say it's like surprising, but maybe not always expected things is that there's a lot of variation in hair morphology within an individual. And actually, the biggest implication for that has been the way that hair has been used in forensic cases, where you really can't say that a hair sample belongs to a certain individual because there's so much variation on an individual scalp and so much overlap between individuals. And so there has been some work that's been done on quantifying that variation, but we, of course, need more data, and especially kind of understanding it from a developmental perspective. What I think is really cool is baby hairs. For people who have baby hairs, like those kind of small, short hairs on the edge of your scalp or hairline, they're a very different texture, morphology than some of your other scalp hair. And so that's like this very interesting example of how the same DNA is being used in different ways. And I think that now that we have better methods, hopefully that more people can use, that's going to be something that we can answer in more depth.
Thanks for the presentation. I just wanted to build off of that question, and I was just thinking about the ways in which different people understand different elements of the head, and thinking like the kitchen and edges
Yes.
as things that
Yep.
certain demographics of people understand.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if there's a potential for like higher variation among certain groups in those areas that leads to that. I also have to say I didn't know what brunette was until about 5 years ago, because I've never heard it referenced for Black people before.
Yep.
And even looking at people's hair, I can't tell you what a brunette is. But I'm wondering if all those things like play into potential differences.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the examples that I always give is like the near fights that I've been in when someone really insists no, I'm a dirty blonde, not a light brunette, which is apparently very important for identity. But actually that culturally mediated understanding of variation, I think, is very important. So some of the categories that we see in the scientific literature, they don't at all interact with categories that are used popularly, especially among Black women in the natural hair movement. They have their own categorization where you'd think, oh wow, look at the level of resolution that they have. Why is that not reflected in science? And the answer to that is very complicated. But what I think is important, and important for me moving forward, is actually making sure that people who've previously not been represented in these spaces understand that their observations are literally scientific observations. And so these discussions that we've had about the kitchen and whether your edges are straight or curly or whatever, that is actually really important data. And so having more representation from people who interact and engage with those traits in that way in a daily basis is going to speed up our science, because maybe I'm looking for the wrong words, but I've never seen any publications talking about baby hair. So I'm like, where is the GWAS on baby hair texture? I think that's something that could help really move forward our science, and it's one of those low-hanging fruits that's just a question of, oh, I didn't even notice that before for certain people.
You just mentioned baby hair, so I thought I would even go a little bit earlier in the developmental process, and would love to hear you say anything about lanugo, I think it's pronounced, the hair that grows sometimes in fetal development. And there's, just to hear you talk, do you think we have a good explanation for why that exists? Is it about body warmth, to stay warmer? Does that make sense to you?
So I am very much a spandrels of San Marco girly. So for those of you who aren't familiar with that terminology, I can just abbreviate it by saying some things aren't necessarily the subject of selection. They just kind of come along for the ride and change along with other things that are actually important. And that is the reason that I really want to start exploring sex, because there are a lot of things that are impacted by hormones that might not necessarily be the target that is being selected for. And when it comes to lanugo hair and the different endocrinological variations that we have throughout development, I think that that is something that we see a lot of. Like that might be something that is a side effect of something else. I don't think that there is a functional reason why lanugo hair would be protective for a baby. And I say that mainly because the hair is so fine, and human babies are so close to their mothers or parents that I don't think that that protection would make a huge source of difference. But yeah, again, like that's something that I'm very interested in starting to explore, because the way that those hairs change, it's the same hair follicle and it can do all these different things. And when you look at the hair follicle, it's really this mini organ that goes through many life cycles. And so I think really looking into that can help us understand what switches are being turned on and off, maybe learn something about the evolutionary history of those switches. And it might be that we find that at some point there was something that was very important. Maybe hair loss first occurred in babies. Maybe that's where, what the structure was of that evolutionary change. But currently, like, we don't have enough information to answer that.
Dan. Oh, sorry, Dan, just a second, because we have to turn the volume up on this.
Hear me?
Now we can, yeah.
Okay. Thanks for a really stimulant. Oh wow, I'm getting crazy feedback.
Muted.
Turn my volume
I
down.
think you
That helps.
shouldn't mute it.
Sorry.
Can you mute the team?
Thanks for a stimulating presentation. I have a couple of comments or questions, but first I have a quote for you as you move into the next phase of your investigations, where you're looking at changes in patterns with age, and that's that my scientifically minded grandfather, from whom, as you can see, I received 25% of my genes, that he didn't actually lose hair, it just moved down.
Sorry,
So my questions are as follows. Your presentation on more regulation and scalp hair is really interesting. If we look analogously at cultural evolution, at clothing in hot climates, right? What we see is that people have loose layers of insulation, so air circulates, but they're protected. But importantly, it's always white, right? So, and maybe this is a constraint on optimality, as you were earlier. My question is, right, if high curvature hair at low latitudes evolve protect from solar radiation, then why isn't it white even when the individuals have high melanin content elsewhere?
So, I don't think it makes sense to unmute.
Okay, you just changed the volume, but not the mute.
So to answer that question, it has to do with the misconception that light hair would be superior. So first of all, there's actually some papers that have been written about how people don't just wear white clothing in these very insulated places. There is dark clothing, and there are also mammals that have dark fur in these places, which you would think is like counter to what you want, but it actually makes sense if you think about how radiation that is traveling from the sun can refract downwards. And that's the last thing you want. You don't want it to be reflecting down onto your scalp. Instead, you want it to be captured at the top level and stay at the top level. And if you have blonde hair, that is just going to be able to travel down to your scalp anyway, and so that doesn't actually really help. And there's a lot of mammalian research that's been done on mammalian coat variation, where basically what they've been able to demonstrate is that, yes, color matters and has an effect, a measurable effect in the directionality that we would expect. But once you get over, I think it was either 2 centimeters or 2 inches, I know that's a big difference, a unit of 2 of hair in depth, it doesn't matter what the color is, because that structural protection, that distance between the skin and the top of the hair is actually what is maximally protective. Okay, so I think there's going to be a second question. I think there was.
hair morphology and.
Okay, I can just hear you now.
We need to
Do you hear me now?
start over now. Yeah. We have to keep switching the volume on and off, otherwise it doesn't.
Okay. It's more just an observation as you expand your foci of research, which is that scalp hair morphology and facial hair morphology seem to be only loosely linked, if at all, right? There are individuals who have very low curvature scalp hair and high curvature facial hair. And I think there may be the reverse as well. Have you thought about, possible linkages or dislinkages between those two functional reasons, explanations for those patterns?
So I just want to make sure that oh, actually I figured it out. I just muted myself. And if I mute myself, then, wait, actually, can you hear me? I didn't think about that. Can you hear me? Dan, can you hear me? No? Okay, I got to unmute myself, sorry. If I understood the question correctly, it was some people have curly facial hair and less curly scalp hair and vice versa. What's the link or lack of link between those? So first of all, shockingly maybe, facial hair is not best described on a spectrum of straight to curled. There is another, I want to say like type of variation that occurs there where it's more of an irregular kink to the hair. So it's not necessarily the same as scalp hair. And its cross section is different. It's thicker as well. So there's other things going on there. And obviously they're impacted by hormones, but it's not clear how, and it's not clear what's going on there. And I would say just in general, over the entire body, there's like a pretty good amount of variation, but we don't have the data sets yet that have, full body and multiple samples per different body site of hair and hair morphology. And once we have that, we can think a little bit more about covariation and see what's going on and how that relates to that person's genome. But until then, it's not clear what is being basically switched on and off in an individual as their hair develops. Mm-hmm.
So I think I understood what you were saying about there's no necessary causal relationship between the amount of melanin and curly hair, right? But as far as the GWAS studies go, so it could be that there was selection, right, that is selecting for, especially if there is this sort of thermoregulatory kind of function, right, that's sort of selecting for both on the same SNP or the same, this is where my genetics knowledge gets bad, right? Mm-hmm. Or they could be, separate processes that have both been selected for in similar environments, mm-hmm. right? And I'm just wondering what we know about that, and in particular I was sort of curious about it because in Australia, Aboriginal Australians, right, have very straight hair, unlike Papuans.
Yeah.
And so if we knew, I know there are probably lots of different genes involved in things like that, but why there's a disconnect in that one place and not other places.
So there's disconnect in other places as well, right? If you think of South and Central Americans, straight hair, dark skin. Southeast Asians, some of them, straight hair, dark skin, or wavy hair and dark skin. And so the easiest explanation I can give is that based off of all of the research I've done so far, scientists say, I say, that what we hypothesize happened is that the hair loss, the body loss, the body hair loss for humans occurred at a certain time point, probably around 2 million years ago, Homo erectus, and that might be the same time that we either kept scalp hair or developed more tightly coiled scalp hair. But when it comes to skin pigmentation, we see that it was important until basically very recently. We couldn't do anything about UV radiation until sunscreen, short of physical barriers. Now, what was the function of tightly coiled scalp hair? How did that help us? Did it help us because we were able to go further distances without needing as much water? Did it help the survival of infants? Was it, maternal energy expenditure? It's really not clear what it was. But based off of how the trait is distributed around the world, my intuition is to say that it was the subject of selection early in human evolution, and then after that, it was mostly affected by genetic drift. Again, do not have the data to conclusively state this, but that's my intuition, that there were cultural behavioral mechanisms that were able to overcome or step in wherever tightly coiled hair was initially helping humans, and that's why you kind of see this disconnect. And also, tightly coiled hair is really only helpful in dry places because it doesn't help with ambient temperature. That's a terrible explanation for the Martu because obviously they're in a relatively dry place, but it does explain why there would have been no selective pressure or benefit in the Amazon, because if it's hot and wet, you can't do anything. You could just suffer, is basically what I found. So I know that's not a great explanation, but once we know a little bit more about the genetic variants that are associated with it, we can start exploring that question if it's on the same haplotypes, if it evolved multiple times in multiple populations. But currently, it's not clear, and it makes sense that those would be decoupled.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.